with by Paul. He was a devout, probably a member of the Essenes, a devout Jew who thought his brother was nuts until he confronted him at the resurrection. And because of the Middle Eastern belief that a blood relative must rule in the absence of the founder, which produced the Shiites in contrast to the Sunnis of the Muslims, who went with the one that had the spiritual leadership, the Shiites went with the bloodline. James was put in charge of the Church of Jerusalem. And all he did was add a belief that Jesus was Messiah. You still had to keep the law. And the fight occurred at the First Council. You all know that history. He pastored 19 years in Jerusalem. A change, total, of brother, the hardest people to convince, changed to a believer, and still a devout, Pharisaical, practicing Jew, believing Christ is the Messiah, keeper of the law. They say he prayed so much in the temple he had knees like camels. It's not a pattern of a liar. What about Paul? I left him out of many of the previous messages. Paul, he's taking paper. He held the coat of those who stoned Stephen. He had papers to put under arrest Christians worshiping in the synagogues at Damascus. Cataclysmically changed until the rest of his life. Beatings, torture. He can end, I've kept the faith. They all changed for the better, from a murderer, an imprisoner of those that disagreed with his faith, to an apostle of love. He wrote 1 Corinthians 13. These are cataclysmic changes. I hope I'm not boring you, but I'm going to finish this. Number two, there's intrinsic, inside evidences of truthful reporters. Contrary to their own interest, they paint bad pictures of themselves. That counts in a court of law when you're evaluating the credibility of the witness. You are making statements that hurt your cause. Mark writes to Gentiles, to a Jew that read the book of Enoch, which was prominent in that day, and Daniel, Son of Man means you're the Messiah coming in clouds of glory. Everybody agrees Mark wrote either to the Gentiles at Alexandria in Egypt or to the Romans. They never read the book of Enoch. They don't know anything about Son of Man messiahology. Yet, writing to try to prove that Jesus is the Son of God, he has Jesus referring to himself in the shortest gospel, more than any other gospel, as Son of Man. Contrary to his objective, he's being true to the story. Little things suggest honest reporters. He has the disciples before the 5,000 miracle. Where do we buy bread? One passage has it. He has the disciples. Another says he has Philip. Separate, written in separate places. Why do you ask Philip? You go to another gospel, John. Philip was from Bethsaida. And the place that he asked the question is near Bethsaida. So the logical one to ask where to buy bread, Philip. You have to read at least 2 gospels to find that out. When the throng presses at Lake Gennesaret, one of the gospels says he stepped into, and you've heard me enough to know that the definite article is very important in the Greek. He stepped into the boat. The throng pressed and he stepped into the boat. You have to go to another gospel written in a different place to find that before the throng pressed in, he instructed his disciples to secure a small boat. So now the other one is saying he stepped into the boat. Little intrinsic evidences of truth. Why would they, if they're making up a lie, have women as the first witnesses when women were not allowed to testify because they were not considered a truthful witness or an adequate witness? They're telling the truth. Little things like John ran ahead of Peter and got to the tomb first, waiting. John was younger. Peter was older. I could go for hours on these little intrinsic evidences of truthful reporting. Let's just take one more. Each of the Gospels tell of this trial before the high priest. One of them says they smote him on the face and said, prophesy. That's all. Another one says they smote him on the face and said, prophesy, thou Messiah. You have to go to a third one to read. They first blindfolded him and then smote him on the face and said, prophesy, tell us who hit you. That's why cops separate the witnesses. But out of the different piecemeal, you're going to get the common thread of truth. These people, if they were conniving and a generation later somebody's making up a lie, they would protect themselves against such things as having Jesus refer to himself as Son of Man, which presupposes a knowledge of Old Testament Scripture. Again and again, intrinsic evidences. Number 3, I could go on with 100 of these. Oh, let me try one. One more. They pierced him. Out came blood and water. They weren't yet sophisticated enough to know about the separation of blood. To them, just blood and water came out. Why not just say blood? They told the truth. The price they paid. Bartholomew was skinned alive with a whip, the persecution for the message. Flayed to death with a whip in Armenia. Andrew crucified on St. Andrew's cross. Peter crucified upside down. Thomas pierced with a sword near Madras. Luke hanged by idolatrous priests in Greece. Mark dragged to death in the streets of Alexandria. You know the record of Paul, of the Jews 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one, thrice beaten with rods, stoned, a day and a night in the deep, on with a record of his persecution. All of them save John, a horrible martyr's death. Now this is St. Thomas Aquinas. Great proof. Number 1, you don't pay that kind of price for a lie, particularly if you're dying alone. I could believe that we might concoct a story You want to be Peter over in Rome? Mr. Brack? Sam? You want to be Thomas in India? And I'll be Bartholomew in Armenia. No TV. There's no wire service. There's no telegrams. There's no CNN. I don't even know if I write you a letter, I can get it to you. And we may never see each other again. But a few years ago, we concocted this story. We bet on this wrong horse. And he died a cursed criminal. To save face, we concocted the story. I can believe the three of us are together. Either one of us wants to be the one to let the others down and break faith. We got to support the story. Scatter us. I'm alone in Armenia. You don't even know where I am, neither do you. They're beating me to death, flaying me to death with a whip, and all I got to say is, whoa! Lord Caesar! I'm a liar, what do I care? We made it up. Story, it's wonderful. Storytellers are abound. And I get off the flogging, and I meet you later. I say, Sam, man, they tried to get me to renounce the story, but man, I stuck to it. I didn't break faith. And Mr. Brack, I want you to know, I didn't let us down. How are you going to know? Since I'm a liar, the issue is liar or honest. I don't expect this to be some divine canonized story. We just saved face. I'm over here in Armenia and my skin's coming off. Hey! Catch the next boat out and tell you how I stuck to the story. Same goes for you in your place and you in your place. Psychologically inconceivable. 1900 plus years, you find the slightest evidence anywhere that any one of these storytellers ever reneged on their story. Dying alone for a lie. Inconceivable. I remember my professor, Larry Thomas, saying to me, when I finished to this point, Gene, I agree. They believed their story. They were telling what they believed to be true. So therefore, some one of your other 8 facts must be wrong. I smiled at him and said, I got you, sir. This experimentalist, the major spokesman of John Dewey on the West Coast, progressive education experimentalism, who wept in the closing social philosophy class as he described the ontology of experimentalism, and our only being is like a wave in the sea, subsequently became a Catholic before his death. I want to believe, and I'll ask him up there, did that knowing statement, I got you, make you look at the facts and come to the conclusion that made me lay the last book down and say there isn't any other explanation? He came out of that grave. If that's true, I don't need any other definition of God. He is the center of the religious universe. He is the source of authority. It was his use of the Old Testament that made me drench myself in it. He did ransom me. He did pay the price for my sins. He is alive today as my hilasterion. And as I trust in God's promise, I no longer have to be perfect. He puts the perfecter in me as I keep the connection of trust and faith. My hilasterion brings me joy, and that's my message today.